Thank you all for coming. My name is L.J. Stambuk. I'm the President CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. Today we're in for a treat. David Rothkopf. That's all I'm going to say.
I'm Mike Hawley. I'm on the board of the World Affairs Council, and thank you very much for coming today. You know, at the World Affairs Council, what we say is we do our best to present to our members and to the community speakers of significant stature, topics of great import, and information that's timely and relevant. And I think we've hit the trifecta today with David Rothkopf. You've likely read David's materials and resume in our program materials, and so. But the takeaway items are these. David's a prolific writer, both of books and probably more important, contemporary commentary in Foreign Policy magazine. He's the editor and CEO of FP Group, which is the organization that controls and operates Foreign Policy magazine. He's also a regular contributor to publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Newsweek, Time, etc. And, you know, he comes to his positions and perspectives with portfolio, as we say. He's provided analysis, counsel on international affairs, trade, and diplomacy for many years in both the public sector as well as the private sector. Some highlights of his career include directing thousands of people at the U.S. International Trade Administration, where he served as acting and then deputy undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade Policy. He has done stints with various economic and international publications, and he's been a teacher. He's taught international affairs at Columbia, Harvard, Yale, other leading universities. I don't know what David is going to talk about today, but it really doesn't matter, because I guarantee you it's going to be interesting, thought-provoking, and timely. You know, maybe some hints. I thought, well, you know, what can I do to kind of warm up the crowd for David? And, you know, some hints on what he might say are maybe in some of the publications he's done recently. He's got a book, for instance, that is in galleys now probably, but will be published in a few months. And it's called, the title of it is National Insecurity, Making U.S. Foreign Policy in an Age of Fear. And then let me just read for you a few titles from recent pieces that he's done in Foreign Policy magazine, just for flavor. And I suspect David writes his own captions. We can get him to confirm or deny that. But some recent articles were, quote, America can't fix the Middle East, but it can fix its Middle East policy. Another, quote, we are losing the war on terror. The bad guys are gaining momentum. Another one, quote, clean up on aisle one. Obama rehashes his Walmart foreign policy. Another, quote, through Syria darkly, will Assad agree to a political solution? And the last one I'll mention is, quote, Vladimir Putin's terrific, triumphant, all good, totally badass year. And I'll just read you the quick lead-in for that last one. Quoting David, admit it, you wish you were Vladimir Putin right now. Enemies fear him. Allies are grateful to him. Women are drawn to him. Jimmy Fallon imitates him. Even Edward Snowden wants to be his video buddy. To paraphrase that great geopolitical analyst Alicia Keys, this guy is on fire. So says David Rothkopf. We're in for a treat, and with no further introduction being required, please join me in giving a warm Charlotte welcome to a prodigious intellect, David Rothkopf.
He didn't read all of my recent titles. In fact, I know that he skipped over one because not too long ago I spoke of President Obama's foreign policy, which he himself characterized as don't do stupid, well, I think you were timid about the sensibilities. Yeah, well, I understand, because you've never heard language like that down here in Charlotte, I'm sure. And I'll try to avoid it myself, although we will be talking about U.S. foreign policy. And given the state of U.S. foreign policy, not just now, but for the past 10 years, you know, it's hard not to revert to expletives at some point or another. But let me begin with a radical concept, and I'll frame a few thoughts and deal with a couple of issues, and then let's open it to the floor. My beat is the world, and I'd be very happy to talk to you about any corner of the world that you want to talk about. But here's the radical thought. George W. Bush and Barack Obama are both good people. They both tried to do their best to protect the United States of America. They both approached it in radically different ways, and they both made terrible mistakes. We are at some point going to look back on this period in history, and we are going to say, following 9/11, the United States of America went into a kind of collective post-traumatic shock because we had exposed to us vulnerabilities we didn't know we had. And those vulnerabilities were then compounded because of the way we reacted to the problems that we had, because of the way that we lashed out, because of the solutions that we sought. Solutions picked by people trying to do the right thing, following their principles, but overreaching, overreacting, and at the end of the day, doing precisely the wrong thing to respond to terror. Because at the end of the day, the objective of the terrorist is not to take down the building, it's not to kill thousands of people, it's to put terror inside of you, it's to get inside of your head. And if what you do makes that worse, if you reach out, if you invade other countries, if you make other people angry, if you pass laws that violate core principles of your country, if you buy into the idea that we bought into, that the risk was everywhere and from everybody, what are you doing? You're doing the work that the terrorist at the end of the day wants you to do. So for example, we were struck. Here were 19 guys who got on a plane, flew into a couple of buildings, destroyed 14 acres of lower Manhattan. And we thought, holy mackerel, if 19 guys could do what once only a country could do, think of the risk. And then we thought, wait a minute, what if one of those guys got a nuclear weapon and put it in a knapsack, or got some anthrax and sent it out to people? What if one person were the risk? And what if that person wasn't from the Middle East? What if they were from Asia? What if they were from Latin America? What if they were from here? Well, follow the logic. At the end of that road, everybody's a threat. And when everybody's a threat, you have national insecurity, you don't have security, you can't protect yourself from a world in which everybody is a threat. And then that vulnerability was compounded by the world's negative reaction to what we did, by choosing to invade a country, by choosing to set up Guantanamo, or choosing to establish the prison in Abu Ghraib and run it the way that we did. And then what happened? We had a financial crisis. And the financial crisis called into question the functioning of the U.S. economy. Our closest allies in Europe were saying American capitalism is dead, or American capitalism is under siege. But also, the financial crisis revealed something else. The financial crisis revealed the degree to which, like an earthquake sometimes, pulls away the sediment, you could sort of see inside what's underlying. It awakened us to the notion that there are deep inequalities in American society that are not being addressed. In fact, that from the period from 2000 through now, the first period of 14 years in American history where GDP went up, productivity went up, jobs stayed flat, wages went down a little bit. That never happened before. That's the system breaking. And when we recovered, 90% of the recovery went to the top 10% of the people. So now we're shaken because we have these threats from afar. We're shaken here at home. And what's the reaction to that? On the left and on the right. It's a pretty natural reaction. In fact, it's a reaction that Americans have had after every conflict that we've ever been in. The reaction is, let's stay the heck away from the rest of the world. This is a dangerous place. Let's not make any more mistakes. And so we then went to the opposite extreme. We went to the extreme where we were afraid of ourselves. We were afraid of what we might do. We were afraid of situations that were sloppy. We started saying things like, well, if there's no neat solution, we're not going to do it. If there's no clear exit, we're not going to go and get involved in it. And what happened? Well, you've seen what happened. Because 3 years ago, ISIS, this terrorist group that you've been reading about in the past couple of weeks, was a group of thugs in Syria. It was a street gang. It was scores of people or hundreds of people. And today, 3 years later, it's 10,000 people. It is the most highly funded terrorist organization in the world. It has a social media strategy. It has an electronic annual report that you can go on, and instead of, like the annual report of a company where it says, here are our projections for next year in terms of sales, it says, here are our projections for next year in terms of attacks, in terms of places that we're going to take over, in terms of places we're going to influence. And it's the best financed terrorist group ever. They robbed banks. They robbed one bank in Mosul last week and got away with $400 million. Okay, so that's pretty impressive, except they're robbing banks everywhere. They're also doing extortion. They're capturing oil wells. They're taking the oil. They're smuggling the oil out. They're making money on the oil. And on top of that, when they go in, they do what Genghis Khan used to do. You recall Genghis Khan, favorite of everybody. Genghis Khan would go, take over something, and he would immediately impose taxes. And they go in and they impose taxes. So they have taxes, bank robbery, extortion, oil, cash flowing in. They've also got, and this is why they're really dangerous, they've got thousands of foreign fighters coming in from the United States. One of them who came from the United States was the first US-born suicide bomber in Syria just a few weeks ago. Some of them for Europe, they go back to Europe. The attacks that you saw in Belgium a couple of weeks ago in the Jewish museum in Belgium, 2 of those people had fought in Syria, learned how to be terrorists, and then gone back to Europe. The estimate of the number of people like that in Syria right now is between 7,000 and 20,000. The majority of them are within ISIS. ISIS is now going out and operating like a country. It goes into Iraq. In January, it took over Fallujah, which we had fought for twice. In January, it took over Fallujah. A couple weeks ago, it took over Mosul. It now controls land in Syria and in Iraq, that's bigger than Jordan. And it has a border on Jordan. And it's rewriting the borders of this part of the world. You just got to ask yourself, you can say, I don't want to see the United States of America getting involved anywhere else again. Certainly not the Middle East. The Middle East is dangerous, people die there. And you say, under no circumstance, if I were president of the United States, we would never do that. And you just got to ask yourself, how far into Jordan do they have to go before you would change your view? Jordan is a vital ally. It's a pillar of stability in the region. It's been there for us through thick and thin. The king of Jordan is a friend of the United States. His father was a friend of the United States. It's helping keep a large portion of that region moderate. And we certainly have an interest in keeping that region moderate. It's not just oil, it's also stability. But how far into Jordan do they have to go before people who care about Israel start getting concerned? There's a point, there's a red line. It's not one of those red lines the president makes up in the course of a conversation, a news interview where he sort of makes one up about Syrian chemical weapons. There is a real red line in Jordan, where if you get across that red line, if they get across it, Israel's in play, Lebanon's in play, the government in Jordan is in play. And so you can say, well, I don't want to get involved in that. Well, what's the lesson of 9/11? I mean, there are lessons of the war in Iraq. Don't go and invade a country in a stupid way. Don't go and put American lives at risk in the wrong way. But the lesson of 9/11 is faraway problems don't stay far away. We're in a global world. Things are connected. We have to find solutions. Does that mean we have to be the world's policeman? No. Does that mean we have to go and invade other countries? No. Does that mean, however, that we have to do something sometimes? Yes, we do. Sometimes it's diplomacy. Sometimes it's putting economic pressure. Sometimes it's supporting our, working together with allies to get action. Sometimes it's drones. Sometimes it's cyber. Sometimes it's special forces. It's usually a cocktail of things. But you can't not use the tools in the quiver because you don't have a perfect scenario, because you don't have a no-risk scenario, because you won't act until you're sure things are going to turn out okay. And that's the other extreme that we've gone to. And I think people will look back on this period, Democrats, Republicans, people from outside the United States, and they'll say they followed the pattern of people when they go through a shock. And they reacted one way, and then they reacted the other way. And hopefully, they've come to a point where they say, wait a minute, let's get a grip on things. Because we actually have made ourselves safer. We've hardened our assets here. We've got security that's better. We also understand that the way you fight terror is with intelligence plus very, very targeted action, that you don't go and wage big wars, that the concept of a war on terror, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said, is a flawed concept because it's the first time in history that somebody wanted to wage a war against a tactic. Instead, there are targeted ways to go after terror, also financial ways to put pressure on terrorists, financial ways to put pressure on countries that harbor terrorists. There are operations that reduce your risk. Can you eliminate all your risk? No. So you have to know that you can't. You have to know how you're going to respond the next time. And countries that regularly face things like terror attacks do respond properly. They do not go crazy and change their foreign policy after every attack. They deal with it in a set way. They deal with it in a harsh way. They get justice. They protect their people. But they don't stop doing what they're doing. They don't stop being who they are. They deal with it in a more balanced way. And I think we've learned that out of this period. We've also had some miracles happen here in the United States, though, during that period. At the beginning of this period, we were extremely vulnerable to energy pressure from the Middle East. Today, it's a whole different picture. If you pick up today's Wall Street Journal, the lead story in the front page of the Wall Street Journal is the United States exporting oil for the first time since the 1970s. Okay? The United States will become the world, and by some measures already is, the world's leading producer of energy, the world's leading exporter of energy. It is going to be, to a degree, self-sufficient. Now, we have to put a caveat with that. There's no such thing as energy independence. We live in an interdependent world. Markets depend on other markets. There are other pressures there. But we have something that's not only giving us a little more security and a little more choice, it's also going to create a lot of jobs. It's also going to create a lot of growth. We don't want to overhype it. I think there's some hype in the projections of how shale may carry us forward. But it's got the U.S. growing. The United States has a great demographic advantage. It's called Mexico and Canada. We've got young people. By 2050, there will be 650 million people in North America. China's population is going down. China's population is getting older. By 2050, the average population of North America, the average age, will be lower than the average age of the population of China because of the one-child policy. So we're going to be younger. We're going to be big. We have infrastructure. We have the best system of college and post-collegiate education in the world. We have all this energy. There are certain areas, new technologies, 3D manufacturing, material science, and others, where we are out in the lead. There is no reason not to assume that we are at a moment of American Renaissance, a point of inflection, where in the 21st century, the United States can be stronger and more prosperous than it was in the 20th century. But we can't live in a gated community. We can't put a wall up around the United States because that prosperity will depend on exports to the rest of the world and imports from the rest of the world. It'll depend on global businesses doing business here as well as doing businesses there. It'll depend on trade, whether you like it or you don't like it. It'll depend on investment flows and capital, whether you like it or whether you don't like it. And so you've got to have a policy of engagement. And the world is a sloppy place. So you can't wait to only deal in those circumstances where everything's fine. And you can't turn your back and leave when you don't have a solution. Sometimes you got to roll your sleeves up, and sometimes you got to work your way through the problem on the ground. And we've got examples where, take Libya. We went into Libya. It was possibly, my sense, probably the right thing to do at the time. But we then got out with that because we didn't have a plan to do after we went in and got rid of Gaddafi. And so what's the case of Libya right now? Complete chaos. And if you look at around the world right now, I've given you the the United States has got some opportunity. I don't want to depress you. It's lunchtime. You're having a good lunch. But, you know, look around the world. Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Tunisia, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the South China Sea, the Horn of Africa, the Central African Republic, Nigeria and Boko Haram, Mali, Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world. We have more problems in more places right now than we have had at any time ever. I had lunch with Zbigniew Brzezinski just 2 weeks ago, and he said, I've never seen anything like this. Is an 80-plus-year-old student of the world, and he just said, I've never seen anything like it. We live in a time of unparalleled instability. All the international institutions we have for dealing with these things are well past eligibility for Medicare. Every single one of them was designed to be weak. It was designed to be useful to us when we needed it, but not so burdensome that it could guide us or force us into another place. We need to deal with certain things multilaterally, whether it's climate or whether it's the threat of pandemic internationally, or whether it's the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, or whether it's issues like genocide, or whether it's issues like cyber warfare, for which we don't have any of the principles with which to deal. And those institutions need to be remade. Well, who's going to remake them? You may not want to have the United States out there and involved, although here, you know, World Affairs Councils tend to be a little bit more forward-leaning on these issues. But you may not want to see the United States be too far involved. But this is the only country in the world where the presumption is of leadership, where the presumption of other countries is to look to us and to see what we do. And when we do nothing, they do nothing. So we have to know that being involved doesn't mean the Iraq War. We have to know that being involved can be done in a constructive way. We have to know that the use of force doesn't mean the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, that there are appropriate times and places to use it in limited, responsible ways. And we have to know that sometimes when our allies don't work with us on things and we can't pressure them into doing it, and by the way, we need to be better at diplomacy, we need to be better at persuasion. We live in an era in which when there's multiple major powers, you really have to go back to the playbook and learn how to do that. But we have got to know that sometimes we're going to have to do things that the rest of the world isn't going to like, because that's what leadership is about. It's also about doing things sometimes that the American people don't like. In July of 1940, when polled on whether the United States should get involved in the war in Europe, and we already knew what the war in Europe was pretty well by July of 1940, the percentage of American people who supported the idea of U.S. involvement in Europe was 17%. It's lower than the percentages now on a lot of these things. Does that mean that we shouldn't have gone and gotten involved in the Second World War because 83% of the American people didn't want to do it? Where would the world be? Where would we all be? You know, it's a very tough question. You can't shrug it off. The reality is that a lot of the time, the majority of the American people are wrong. And leaders have the job of being teachers. They have the job of going and telling people what the situation is and trying to persuade them. And when they can persuade them, great. And when they can't persuade them, then what those leaders have got to do is take action anyway, because that's what they were elected to do. They weren't elected to simply reflect the wishes. They were elected to act in the best interests of. And that's a whole different thing. And so the biggest challenges for us as a country coming out of this period are to grapple with what we think America's role in the world ought to be, and to come up with a way to pursue that role where fear is not the guiding force, where our aspirations are the guiding force, where what we have learned helps to guide us, where we have a clear eye on where we can go in terms of creation of jobs and creation of wealth and creation of prosperity and helping to make the world a safer place. And I think we're on the verge of that. I really do. I really think we're on the cusp of it. I don't think the next 2 years are going to be great. It's not just Barack Obama, by the way. Some of you may want to beat up on Barack Obama. He's doing his best. I think personally, I'm a Democrat. I was in the Clinton administration. And I'll admit it, I was a Hillary Clinton supporter. So, you have to, I was, by the way, the chairman of the policy committee of the very successful Evan Bayh for President campaign. So you can tell I really have a political sense. But, I think Barack Obama's just not a very good foreign policy president. I just don't, and you want to know why? No experience. Hello, America, wake up. 6 out of your last 8 American presidents didn't have any foreign policy experience. Guess what happened? They were lousy at it for a while. The better ones learned and fixed and got better. The ones who were less good didn't, or they didn't get reelected. And I just think that because of what we've been through and because of the lack of experience, because of predisposition, and because of the fact that a lot of people around him are advising certain things, I just don't think he's going to fix this. But I do think that come the next election, both candidates from both parties are going to run against George Bush, and they're going to run against Barack Obama. Both candidates from both parties are going to go out there and they're going to say there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way to deal at home with inequality. There's got to be a better way to deal with health care. There's got to be a better way to deal with the environment. There's got to be a better way to deal with foreign policy. And to be perfectly honest, if you end up with candidates who are roughly from the mainstream of either party, which we typically do, if you end up with Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, for example, you're going to end up with very similar policies. And by the way, this country could do a lot worse than end up with Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush. These are very talented people. I've been in small rooms with both of them where they would sit there and talk issue to issue to issue, no notes, immersed in it, professionals, committed. Now, that's not to say other people couldn't do a good job. I'm just using them as examples. But what I'm saying is I don't think either one of them is, and look at Hillary Clinton's book. I mean, her book just came out, and she's very, very canny and subtle in the book. She's identified 3 or 4 areas where she's laying down the difference. She said, I would have acted earlier in Syria. I would have done more to push out Mubarak earlier so we could control the situation. I would have planned to keep more troops on the ground in Iraq. I would have kept more troops on the ground in Afghanistan to keep the lid on things. Well, you may look at that as canny political leaks, but also look at it that she's saying, I'm going to be different, and it's also true. What she said is true. And so if you think those are better policies, then you could embrace that stuff. So anyway, I'm optimistic. I really feel we're coming out of a period. I feel that the wind is at our back economically at home. Today's data on the last quarter, on the most recent quarter notwithstanding. And I think that there is an opportunity to remake the world. I'll give you an example, which I think was a missed opportunity. Putin, who you read eloquently about, well, it wasn't that eloquent. It was something I wrote, but I enjoyed it. Putin goes into Crimea, goes into Ukraine. I think our response was pathetic. I mean, I could mince words, but it was pathetic, and it had no impact on him. But there was an opportunity, right, to go and say, look, the Atlantic Alliance is 70 years old. It's time to be revitalized. We have a transatlantic trade deal that's percolating that could be the core of a new alliance. We have new threats in the world. Let's have a summit of the leaders of the Atlantic Alliance in Warsaw, Poland right now. Would that have sent a message to Vladimir Putin? Would that have sent a message that we have a vision and a plan and so forth? It's a little thing. It's not, the president's like, do you think we should put boots on the ground in Crimea? The word boots on the ground, the term boots on the ground needs to be struck from his vocabulary. Or we need to have somebody erect a billboard across the street from the White House. No, Mr. President, we don't think that we should have boots on the ground. But there are other things we can do. There are other ways to use our influence. And in this particular case, revitalizing the most important alliance in the world was right there. It was right there for us to do. And instead, we sanctioned 7 guys near Putin and the 17th largest bank in Russia. That was our first measure. And so it's a question of creativity. And this is a gap in Washington. Creativity is a gap in Washington. I did a study that goes at the beginning of this book that's coming out in October, where I looked at the top 10 think tanks in Washington. And I looked at every event and paper and article that they produced in 10 years, 12,000 of them. They were all like, it was like Pee-wee soccer. The same issues, the same people, the same things. Do you want to know what the least followed area by those think tanks was? The smallest of all the categories on the list? Science and technology. Okay? What has changed the world the most in the past 25 years? You know, you go in a room in Washington, somebody will say 9/11, and somebody else will say the fall of the Soviet Union. The thing that's changed the world the most in the past 25 years is that in 1990 there were 12 million cell phones, and today there are 7 billion cell phones. Today the penetration of cell phones in Africa is 80%, of smartphones is 50%. We are effectively at a moment of inflection in history where for the first time in the history of the planet Earth, every human being is part of a man-made system. Every human being is connected to one another in new ways that raise profound new questions about the way we organize society. Because of that cell phone, which will be your bank account and which will be the way that you vote and the way that you get your job and the way that you get your information, you will not be able to compete unless you have a cell phone. Which then says, if you were writing the Constitution today, would it say that you have a right to the internet? Or if you were writing the Constitution, would it say you have a right to electricity? Because you can't compete in today's world. You are disenfranchised. You are out if you don't have electricity and you don't have the internet. And there are a host of other questions that come up for this new era, and nobody is thinking about them. Nobody in Washington, and in fact, at the highest levels in Washington, when it comes to science and technology issues, they just don't have the understanding to do it. The nation's capital is math-phobic. I was talking to Mike Hayden, who used to be one of our top intelligence leaders in the United States, and he would say he would go in and do briefings on cyber, and everybody would look at him like he was Rain Man. You know, no one in Washington ever admits that they don't know something. But why do you think we had the NSA scandal? We had the NSA scandal because there was first of all, the NSA has less oversight than the rest of the intelligence community. But secondly, the stuff that the NSA does when they present it to people, people don't understand it. But you think, Senator so-and-so from someplace is going to go and raise his hand and say, excuse me, could you explain that? I'm a little slow. It is not going to happen. And it didn't. And so people didn't know what was going on. And we went and launched out into do programs to go and grab up every phone call or every email, in countries around the world, without anybody asking the question, what happens if that leaks? What happens to our diplomatic relations? What happens to the internet? Here's the internet. It's connecting the world together. It's this great globalizing force. What if we did something that gave the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians and even countries like Brazil the chance to say, hey, stop the world, I want to get off. I want to have my own internet. I want to have my own rules. I don't want to sell American software products here because they're too much at risk. But there's no Department of Consequences in Washington. Nobody brought this issue up. And so we were exposed on this front. And so if we are going to go forward and take advantage of the economic wind at our back and take advantage of what we've learned from the past 10 years and gain from understanding that good people in both parties trying their best can go in the wrong direction, we're also going to have to infuse our leadership with more creativity. We're going to have to bring new ideas into the conversation. One of the best ways to bring new ideas in the conversation is to get people from outside of Washington, inside Washington, from outside of the government, into the government. And that's why World Affairs Councils are great. That's why I love coming out and talking to them. That's why I have enjoyed speaking to you, and I'm happy to answer any question you've got.
I want to thank you, David, for coming here today and talk to us. And now we're going to go into the Q&A session of the afternoon. And for those of you who do have a question, if you please raise your hand, and I'll kind of call on you. Please have a question. We'll regurgitate your question just so that we can catch it on tape and give David an opportunity to respond. Now, I'm going to kind of use maybe my preemptory position here and just ask maybe the first question. And that would be, is the world really more dangerous today than it was 100 years ago or 50 years ago? Or do we just now know that it is because we are so interconnected?
Well, look, for the period from 1947 or 8 through 1992, the world lived with the possibility of global thermonuclear war, which would have eradicated all life on the planet for all intents and purposes. I, by the way, as a kid, this is a little background, to provide you a little color, but one point when I was like 14 years old, listened to somebody talk about this and went to my dad, who was a scientist at Bell Labs, and I said, Dad, I just heard projection of a nuclear war, and 100 million Americans could die in a nuclear war. That's really awful. And he said, well, no, because he was like that. He said, 100 million people died in Europe during the Black Plague, and the result was the Renaissance. So there's an upside to these things. In any event, but that was a certain kind of risk. The nature of global thermonuclear war was that the costs of undertaking the war were so high that it was a huge disincentive to either side to do it. So it was very dangerous, but it was rather stable. We are now into a period where the costs of war, particularly things like cyber war, are so low that we're actually at the risk that people will never stop doing it. That the United States and Japan, the United States and China and Iran and Russia and all these other countries are constantly firing shots at each other every day now, degrading each other a little bit. And that creates instability. And then our international institutions are weak, which creates instability. And the big powers are leaning backwards because they've got issues, which creates instability. And so we live in a world in which it is much more volatile, in which new technologies exacerbate the volatility. And so whereas I think the risk of global thermonuclear war, well, not zero, is much, much lower than it was, or sort of global existential threat, much, much lower than it was, I think the risk of constant instability and new risks that could touch us is much higher than it was because the system's less stable.
Other questions? Right here, please. The question is, what do we do about ISIS, considering their involvement in the world scene today? How do you address that?
Well, I think the answer to the question is that the world has to do something, and it happens to be one of those moments where a lot of parties in the world who don't often agree on things agree that this needs to be taken care of. Now, we have to be careful. Some of the parties that agree that they want to get rid of ISIS, like the Syrian government and the Iranian government, benefit a little bit from having ISIS out there, and so they may help, but how helpful will they be in the long run, or what will they seek in exchange for their help, becomes a question. But if you look at the moderate states in the region, if you look at the Europeans, if you look at some of the insurgent groups, that they all find ISIS to be a threat. And so I think that it's possible to put together a coalition, as we are attempting to do to some extent, that will provide intelligence to the people who will fight it on the ground, who will be Iraqis and Syrians and the moderate opposition in Syria. I think we can provide air power, and I think we should provide air power, whether it's targeted strike from manned aircraft or drone attacks or Tomahawk missiles or whatever. And I think that military advisors is a first step. I think providing the arms we've promised for a long time to the moderate opposition in Syria is important. I think helping the Jordanians and the Turks and others close their borders so this doesn't extend beyond this is important. I think putting pressure on the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Qataris who've been funding ISIS and other groups to stop the funding is important. And I think that if we do these things, we can shrink it and contain it. But we have to recognize this is not an Iraq problem, it's an Iraq plus Syria problem. And so we could end up with the squeezing the balloon issue. So, you put a lot of pressure in Iraq, they go back into Syria. You put some pressure in Syria, they go back to Iraq. You've got to approach it on two fronts in order for it to be effective. So there are some risks and there are some costs, but the lesson of ISIS is, from what it was 3 years ago to now, every day you wait, the cost of dealing with the problem goes up.
Yes, the gentleman right here. Can you comment on your last book?
Yeah, sure. This will take 2 hours, but no. Look. I try to go back and forth from doing books on security to books on economics and back and forth, just because it's like, you got to work out your arms and your legs. It's like you got to move back and forth. And what I was struck by in the course of actually doing 2 books ago, which was called Superclass, which was on the global power elite and sort of how there is sort of emerged this sort of transnational class of very powerful individuals who have very common interests with one another that diverge sometimes from the interests that they have with their fellow countrymen, was that a lot of the power they had was organizational. And the greatest of that organizational power came in the form of big corporations. And that corporations, if you go back in history, were created to serve the state. They were, enterprises that were designed to last in perpetuity, so you didn't have to reinvent them, and that they could provide economic benefits into the state on an ongoing basis. But some point along the way, and it happened here in the United States, we started ascribing rights to corporations. They started becoming enterprises unto themselves that were able to go and do things on their own and have certain kinds of privileges. This creates some circumstances that we aren't prepared for. So the top 1,000 companies in the world have annual sales that are greater than the GDP of the smallest 100 countries in the world. That Exxon has, annual sales that provide it with resources that are greater than those of the Swedish government, the 30th largest country in the world, and gives it a sort of foreign reach, kind of through international offices, that's greater than their diplomatic service. Is that a bad thing? Only if it's out of balance. Only if they can put their thumb on the scale, because companies, as good as companies are, and we all work for companies, and I think the capitalist system has done wonders for all of you in this room. You all look extremely prosperous, and how many of you are communists? Raise your hand. But the capitalist system has done a lot of good things for everybody. But we know that companies are legally obligated to act in the interest of their shareholders. They are not legally obligated to act in the interest of the public good. And, that means if you've got, a debilitating illness, or you're old, or you're sick, if you leave it to the marketplace, you get cast to the side of the road. And so something has got to be in there, because the purpose of having a society is not to make the society richer, it's to make people's lives better. And if it's to make people's lives better, you need to have some balancing out. And we have a political system that's oriented towards nation states, which are stuck in one place or within their borders. And there are these new powerful enterprises that float across the borders. And they've got influence around the world that's different. And we just haven't come to recognize it or balance it. And so what I try to do in the book is talk about where there are anomalies and how that's led to inequality and how it's led to certain kinds of tensions and how it can be addressed. And the other thing that I talk about in the book, and this is the last point that I'll make about it, is, you know, after the end of the Cold War, there was this moment of euphoria, you know, and so we had, you know, Francis Fukuyama write a book called The End of History. If there was ever a more narcissistic title, you know, for an era, you know, it's like, yeah, we figured it all out. You know, the rest of you, you know, there are no more big issues to resolve going forward. And the idea was that it would be small L, liberal, democracy, markets, you know, everything would be fine. But that's not what happened. Right now, you've got multiple different kinds of capitalism in the world. You've got American or Anglo-American capitalism, which is kind of hands-off, laissez-faire. You've got Northern European capitalism, where the government plays a much bigger role. But you get some really strange things. Like, we think we are ultra-capitalists, and the rest of the world doesn't quite get it, right? But what happened during the last financial crisis? General Motors hit the skids. What did we do? We bailed out General Motors. Why did we bail out General Motors? Because there was no social safety net for the people in General Motors, and if it had fallen, 1 million people would have been out of work. In Sweden, not known as the hotbed of capitalism, although inventing a different kind, they had a car company go bankrupt too. It was called Saab. You know what happened? It went bankrupt. You know why? Because they had a social safety net and a training program there, and they said, we can allow the company to go bankrupt because these people are going to be taken care of and repurposed back into the system. So who's the better capitalist? The one that lets the market do its work or the one that doesn't let the market do its work? And we have to go and analyze these differences, and there's other kinds. There's capitalism with Chinese characteristics. There's large developing country capitalism like India and Brazil, which has got a big social component. And there's small entrepreneurial state capitalism, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Chile, which are, you know, because you're small, you can run a country like a company. In Singapore, every 2 years, they have a strategic review about the future of Singapore. They bring the public sector, the private sector, the academics together. They get into a room and they say, what should we do? Where's our comparative advantage? How do we have to invest in education? How do we have to invest in infrastructure? And they make a plan, and then you know what they do? They act on the plan. They actually produce a budget, and they allocate their resources within the context of that budget, and they grow and they prosper. And, you know, you may say, well, Singapore is authoritarian, and, you know, sure, criticize them for being authoritarian in some respects. But understand, there is a competition. There's a marketplace for markets out there. There's a marketplace for capitalism. And one of the things that's going to define our era is how that competition between capitalisms works out and what roles they assign the state and what roles they assign the private sector.
Yeah, how are the banks versus the government relationship here in the U.S. in the wake of the recession?
Well, there's one part of your question, there's a premise in your question that I'm not sure that I agree with, and that is that you're sure that you'd be interested in what I think. You know, look, there are more too big to fail banks today than there were before. There's more risky behavior in global derivatives markets than there were before. The housing markets have responded much too slowly because we bought into a concept which was risk to banks was systemic risk, but risk to people with mortgages was not. We didn't help get those people back into the system. And we live in a system that's fundamentally corrupted by money. And the reality is you can't get to be president of the United States without going through the first primary, and the first primary is not New Hampshire, the first primary is on Wall Street. And you got to go in and you've got to raise, you know, you got to prove you can raise hundreds of millions of dollars to be president. And if you think there is no relationship between the hundreds of millions of dollars coming largely from financial institutions and Democrats and Republicans like, you know, equally essentially saying, we're going to go easy on you guys, then, you know, you're more optimistic about the nature of man than I am. And, you know, I mean, I think the perfect example of this is I was in the Clinton administration, and we promoted the end of Glass-Steagall. And, we were behind that. I was a senior economic official in those discussions. And I was sitting in the room going, yes, 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 markets, markets, markets. Bob Rubin, you're a genius. Larry Summers, you know, not, well, anyway. But, and let's go and do this. And so essentially the markets at that point said, get off our backs, and we said, okay, we'll get off your back. And then the market, and they said, trust us, we'll be self-regulating, And how many bankers do you know, even the good ones who are in a room like this, who would get into a self-regulating taxi cab or brush their teeth with self-regulated toothpaste? But the premise here is that bankers are somehow better people than toothpaste makers and that we could trust them, right? And so we did, and then what happened was everything went to hell in a handbasket, and the phone rang in Washington. It was like, remember where we said get off our backs? We could use a hand. Write us a check. So Washington, because of its power structure, sat and wrote a check. Well, that was pretty remarkable in the context of all of these things. But then what happened even next was even more remarkable. As soon as those checks cleared, the banks got back up on their hind legs. They called up Washington and said, you know what? We'd really prefer it if you got off our back again. And so we then went into this kind of faux financial reform where there was some reform done. But there was also some reform that really wasn't quite reform. So in doing my last book, one of the things I did was I talked to some of the people who were at the Office of Management and Budget who were in the room when they said, in order to impose this new Dodd-Frank reform, we need to have more supervisors and we need to have more computers to calculate whether the banks are doing the right thing. And in the room, the decision was made, no, we're not giving you the money for those computers. Well, what's the point of having the law if you're not going to underwrite the supervision? So are banks part of the problem or are they part of the solution? Obviously, they're part of the solution, but there are problems within the structure. And should we, we've moved a little bit in terms of capital ratios, we've moved a little bit in terms of certain kinds of supervision, but there are a lot of problems that remain within the system. And I don't know anybody who's in finance, and that's sort of where my start was. I don't know anybody who's in finance who doesn't think when they look at global derivatives markets or they look at some of the hidden risks that are associated with the nature of modern finance right now, that there are risks that are unattended to, and they will come home to roost sooner or later. Were you interested in my opinion?
Yes, gentleman right here. Can you talk to the post-stress cycle, and how do you kind of avoid that? Or can you moderate that?
Well, look, first of all, I don't know if you can completely moderate it because, we went to World War I, we came back and we said, we don't even want the League of Nations, we don't want to have anything to do with the rest of the world. We went to World War II, we came back in the 1950s, we said, we don't want to go, anywhere beyond our new fancy kitchens with avocado-covered refrigerators. We then went, back into Vietnam, came out and said, we don't want to do this again. We went into, each of the wars that we've gone through, there's been this kind of reaction. I think that's natural. I don't think you can ever really get around it. What I think you can do, however, is that you can learn from the experiences and you can build it in to the system so that one, doesn't react to a terrorist attack the same way we react to the last terrorist attack. That one doesn't disregard certain laws and principles in the same way that we did the last time. And that when we face threats, that we come up with new ways to do it. One of the best things we can do is go and, one of the biggest assets the United States has that no other country in the history of the world has ever had is the network of alliances that we've got. And if we focus on building those alliances, we focus on revitalizing international institutions, we focus on coming up with new mechanisms, and we are willing to lead the way of giving up a little bit of the control that we always demand in those things, in order to let other people assume a little more responsibility in the IMF and in the World Bank and in the United Nations, then I think we'll have a better chance of getting more than us alone having to solve these problems. It's not always going to happen, and sometimes we're going to go and have to take risks. And so then the question is, what's the calculated risk? Not no risk, because that's not a real option. But what are the calculated risks we're willing to take? And we have to evaluate our national interests very carefully. There are very sort of granular points to this. The National Security Council in the White House has the responsibility to manage the development of policy and to manage its implementation. When the National Security Council starts being a mini State Department and it starts going out and taking missions and doing these other kinds of things, it's unable to do those main tasks that it does, and it's unable to do the strategic planning that it's supposed to do. And you need to have a brain somewhere in the government that's got a little foresight. And the foresight part of the brain of the government isn't really functioning extremely well. So that would improve it too. In terms of the economic cycles, the bigger problem in economic cycles is economic cycles. They come and they go. They're a little bit buffeted by these things. But I do think everybody, every business and every individual needs to accept that we are moving into a world where recent market behavior notwithstanding will be more volatile. And one has to go and build strategies around what are the 2 standard deviation events? What are the big things that take you out of the comfort zone that you used to be in, because they're going to happen more frequently. The once in 100-year storms, they now happen every 5 years. The once in 100-year conflicts, they do too. And the once in 100-year market upheavals, they're going to happen more frequently than that. So I do think one of the things we're going to have to do is learn to deal with, anticipate, and prepare for volatility a little better.
Gentleman over here, please. Comment on picking the winning team and how you actually should choose sides?
Look, first of all, there's 2 religious wars going on in the Middle East, right? There's a war between Sunnis and Shias that have been going on for 1,400 years, because this is a war about who succeeds Muhammad as the leader of the Islamic faith. And then within the Sunnis, there's a tension between extremists and moderates. And both of those tensions are happening simultaneously. We can't presume that we are going to fly in from Charlotte Airport, land in the middle of the Middle East, and say, hey, you've had this problem for 1,400 years, do this, it's all going to be taken care of. Because that's not going to work. What we can do is say, what are the stabilizing forces and what are the destabilizing forces in this region, since what we seek is stability? And what are the forces that are promoting positive change and what are the forces that are promoting negative change? And we can put our weight behind promoting the stabilizing forces and the ones that are promoting positive change. The Middle East is going to be a mess for a long time to come. But we also need to have some, clear recognition that if we have no allies in the region, we have no influence in the region. That oil prices, whether we like it or not, are global, and that volatility in this region will cause spikes in oil prices. That if we step out, somebody else is going to step in. And I think that's another big lesson of this. And if that person isn't Vladimir Putin or it's not Beijing, then it's going to be some local potentate or it's going to be Iran, and that's going to cause a problem. So we've got to figure out how to, where those allies are. Now, there are some natural allies. The United States, Israel, Jordan, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, the Saudis. We all disagree on a lot of things, and some of them do some really awful stuff. But on the issue of stabilizing, they're more oriented towards stabilizing. Egypt was a pillar of that. Our failure to address the change there and help smooth out that change has cost us one of the pillars. I think reconstructing that pillar is an important thing to do. Building ties with India is an important thing to do. Recognizing China is going to play a bigger role in this region and becoming more cooperative and bringing them more into the room in our discussions plays a big role in this and so forth. So, there's no magic wand. They're just incrementally better and incrementally worse choices. And I think what we have to recognize, though, is opting out is not one of the incrementally better choices. Opting out is incrementally worse.
I think we have time for maybe 2 questions. Gentleman right here in the back.
Look, the core question, it seems to me, is why is the U.S. not as feared as it was? And the most dangerous portion of any weapon is the finger on the trigger. And if you don't think the finger's going to pull the trigger, the weapon's not that dangerous. And I am not advocating being warrior-like, and I think that, for a period we followed the opposite of the walk softly and carry a big stick policy, and that was a big mistake. But I think that a lot of the world right now thinks the U.S. is leaning away, less inclined to be engaged. And, that's what, Putin does. Putin went into Crimea because he saw what happened in Syria. And he said, I can take advantage. Now, who's the bad actor there? Is it Barack Obama? No, it's Putin. Who's the bad actor in Syria? It's Assad. But they have tested us and our allies. Let's not be so quick to just, say this is all on us. The Europeans haven't responded, our Asian allies haven't responded, our regional allies haven't responded, but we are seen as the head of the coalition. And so they've tested us, and they've discovered time after time we're not going to, do anything. And so at that point, having a carrier battle group doesn't matter. People say that's, for show. Now, look what's happened in, the situation of ISIS. We moved ships into the Persian Gulf in order to provide a platform to launch airstrikes against ISIS, and that sent a powerful message. And so those tools are still there. It's just the question of our attitude with regard to using them.
Okay, one final question. Gentleman back here. What can we do to have more helpful than hurtful political discourse?
Well, gee, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think that the dysfunctionality in Washington is a big impediment to us in terms of international power. I was at a little dinner a couple weeks ago with Hillary Clinton, and she was talking about going to Asia during the government shutdown. And everywhere she went, she said she had to explain to people, don't give up on the United States. This is a hiccup. This is not the system. But of course, in our hearts, we wonder, is this the system? Last year, the United States Congress passed fewer pieces of legislation than any Congress since the Second World War. Now, a lot of the legislation the Congress passes isn't very good, so maybe that's a good thing. But the point is, we got a lot of business to do. The government's supposed to be governing, and it's not doing it. I think there's several levels that we can fix the political discourse. First of all, we have to realize there's systemic problems. If you have gerrymandering of congressional districts and they ensure that a Republican or a Democrat wins, what does that mean? It means that the primaries are the only votes that count, and the primaries are dominated by the more extreme people in either party. And so you end up polarizing the debate in the United States, and you end up running to that polarized audience, and they want the red meat politics, and that gets you into real problems. If you in the Senate have a system where in the 1970s, something like under 20% of all votes, substantially under 20%, went to filibuster, but today it's over 80%. In other words, you've got to have 60% on everything. You're not going to get anything done. That contributes to it. Part of it's the media. You've got media enterprises that are people essentially shopping for their media enterprise by looking for people who agree with them. To me, this is not the way to stretch your brain, but people say, okay, I'm more comfortable in the Fox lane or the MSNBC lane or whatever the lane is, and they go in there, and then they hear people saying the same stuff as they believe over and over again, and everything is cast in a political light. Every discussion is cast in a political discussion. It's not useful to have a discussion about the situation in the Middle East today in terms of, is it Barack Obama's fault or is it George Bush's fault? That doesn't help the discussion at all. What helps is to say, what are our national interests? What are the impediments to our national interests? How do we advance our national interests, giving the resources that we've got and that we're willing to allocate? Who's going to go along with us? What's the plan? What's the time? You have to do it that way. But I'm going to conclude the answer with something that's going to sound horribly like a platitude. But I implore you not to think of it as a platitude. It's not meant as one. It starts with us. How many times have each of you been in a conversation where your reflexive response was a response consistent with whatever political party you're from and whatever political belief you're from? If you then react in that and push back that way, and your kids watch you do it, or your neighbors watch you do it, or the people you work with watch you do it, that's where the problem comes from. We have to start the civil discourse at the grassroots level in a new way. And unless we do that, then we are going to take away the genius of democracy, which is the collaboration of the electorate. And we are going to leave it to the people who are the instigators of divisions within that electorate. And that is a corruption of a very powerful idea. And I think that's something that we all have to fight. But we have to start by winning the battle in ourselves.
I want to thank you, David, for being here today and sharing your insights on foreign policy, the world, and the dangerous status of the world. And we certainly, as being members of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, Our discourse is on international politics, what's happening in the world, and we appreciate your contributing to that.
Thanks.
David is going to be here for a few moments after the event in here, and he'll be signing books, answering questions until he's got to run to the airport. But I want to thank you for keeping me out of trouble. I want to give you something for your wall. In the past, we've given these rather heavy things that people don't like to carry in their suitcases, but we think this is in recognition of your contribution, and thank you for being here today. Something that's easy to carry home.
Thanks,
and
Lon.
thank you again for coming.
appreciate
We appreciate it.